Victoria Hayes had never looked back. That was the thing people said about her in boardrooms, in profiles printed across the covers of business magazines, in the whispered admiration of junior analysts who watched her walk through glass lobbies without breaking stride. She had built Hayes Global into one of the most formidable private equity firms on the East Coast, not by hesitating, not by second-guessing, and certainly not by looking back at anything she had chosen to leave behind. So when the black tow truck pulled out of the long driveway of her Westchester estate on a gray Tuesday morning in October, hauling away her father's old Porsche like a piece of furniture no longer suited to the room, Victoria did not watch it go. She stood at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee she had not touched. And she told herself the only thing she ever allowed herself to feel in moments like that one, that it was simply time. The car had been sitting in the far bay of her 6-car garage for 4 years. A 1973 Porsche 911 Carrera, British racing green. The kind of machine that drew long looks in parking lots and long sighs from men who remembered when cars were built to last forever. It had been her father's single indulgence in a life that was otherwise defined by relentless pragmatism. Richard Hayes had driven that Porsche every weekend for nearly 2 decades, always alone, always early in the morning before the rest of the world was awake. He told people he drove it to think. His daughter always suspected he drove it to escape. After he died, the car sat. The engine seized, rust found the edges of the wheel wells, and Victoria, who had inherited everything else from her father, the company, the instinct, the jaw set in quiet determination, could not bring herself to touch the one thing that reminded her most of him, and so she left it there, beneath a canvas cover, collecting years. She was 36 years old. She ran a company with 700 employees and holdings in 3 countries. The previous week, she had closed a deal worth $340 million that would reshape the logistics corridor between the Great Lakes and the Gulf Coast. She had done it with 4 hours of sleep and a breakfast that consisted of black coffee and a protein bar eaten in the back of a car. She did not have time for a broken Porsche. She did not have time for grief, which was what she refused to call what happened to her chest when she walked past the garage door at certain times of night. She had posted the car in an estate sale, listing under a middleman's name. The price was low. She wanted it gone, and it went. The tow truck disappeared around the curve of the driveway, and Victoria finished her coffee. And the morning continued exactly as mornings were supposed to continue. She had a call with their London partners at 9. She had a board debrief at 11. She did not think about the car again. Not once. Not that entire day. What she did not know, what she could not possibly have known, was that the car was carrying something her father had hidden there with extraordinary care, something that had waited for years inside the body of that machine like a letter sealed inside a bottle and dropped into the sea. She would not know about it for months. By the time she did, everything she thought she understood about her father would be different. Ethan Carter drove a truck that was older than his marriage had been, which was saying something because his marriage had not lasted long. He had bought the truck when his son Marcus was 2 years old, back when he still believed that if you worked hard enough and kept your word and showed up every day without complaint, life would eventually reciprocate. He still believed most of that. The truck was on its 4th set of tires and smelled like machine oil, and the orange air freshener Marcus kept hanging from the rearview mirror because, as his son had informed him at age 9, the shop smell was, quote, embarrassing. Marcus was 12 now, and Ethan had been raising him alone for 7 years, and the truck still smelled like machine oil, and neither of them cared anymore. Carter Auto Repair occupied a converted warehouse unit on the eastern edge of the city, past the rail yard and before the stretch of road where the strip malls gave way to actual land. Ethan had leased it 8 years ago, with a partner who left after 3, taking his equity and his good humor with him, and leaving Ethan with the overhead and the clientele. It was not a beautiful shop. The floors were bare concrete stained with the accumulated history of 10,000 oil changes. The walls held tools the way other walls held family photographs. There was a coffee maker that made coffee the consistency of motor oil and a space heater in the corner that knocked and rattled all winter, and which Ethan had named Gerald because it seemed to have a personality. The shop had regulars who trusted it. A reputation for honest work at honest prices. and a balance sheet that had been operating in the margin between breaking even and breaking down for the past 2 years. Ethan knew every line of that balance sheet. He looked at it on Wednesday evenings after Marcus went to bed. Sitting at the kitchen table with his reading glasses and a cup of tea, adding up what was owed and what was coming in, and trying to find the gap that was going to tell him whether he could keep going. He could, he usually concluded. Barely. But he could. He had been doing sideline work for a while, buying distressed vehicles at auction or through brokers, pulling usable parts, reselling them to specialty shops and vintage dealers. It brought in a few $1,000s a month when he was lucky and covered the gap when he wasn't. He was particular about what he bought. He had been doing it long enough to know which cars were genuinely dead and which were only sleeping, and there was a difference that mattered both practically and to something deeper in him that he rarely examined directly. Ethan Carter believed that machines, like people, deserved a second look before you gave up on them. He had arrived at this belief the long way around, through experience rather than sentiment, and he held it without drama. The call about the Porsche came on a Wednesday in late October from a broker named Dennis, who worked the estate sales circuit, and occasionally threw Ethan a lead when something mechanical came through. Dennis described it as a 1973 911, in rough shape, non-running, partial surface rust. Interior in poor condition, being sold low because the family wanted it off the property. He sent 3 photographs. The first showed the left quarter panel, where the rust was visible but superficial. The second showed the engine bay, which was grimmer. The third showed the interior, and it was in that third photograph that Ethan looked carefully at the door panels and the dash and the way the leather had aged and recognized, in the way only someone who had spent thousands of hours with old machines could recognize, that this was not a car that had been abused, it had been stored. There was a difference. A neglected car and a stored car wore their years differently. The way a person who had been through hardship wore it differently from a person who had simply been kept in the dark. He agreed to the price without negotiating. He had the car towed to the shop on a Friday morning, and when it arrived, his 2 mechanics, Danny and a 22-year-old named Rob who had been with him for 8 months, both looked at it and then looked at Ethan with expressions that communicated, without words, that they found the acquisition entertaining at best and delusional at worst. Ethan had seen that look before. He found it motivating rather than discouraging. He walked around the car once slowly, running his hand along the hood and the fenders, and he said what he always said, which was that every car had a story, and the story was usually worth more than the scrap metal. Rob said that was deep. Ethan told him to go change the oil in the Subaru in Bay 3. He began the teardown that evening, after Marcus had been dropped at his mother's for the weekend. He liked working alone when he was learning a car for the first time. There was something in the silence of an empty shop, the distant hum of the rail yard, Gerald knocking in the corner, the fluorescent lights casting their flat white light over everything that helped him pay attention. He started with the interior, removing the damaged seat backs and the floor mats and the door cards, cataloging what could be cleaned and what was beyond saving. The dashboard components he set aside carefully. He removed the center console and then the side panels behind the rear seats, working steadily and without hurry, letting the car reveal itself piece by piece. He found it when he pulled the left interior panel near the rear quarter section. The panel had come away easily, more easily than it should have, and when he shone his light into the cavity behind it, he saw immediately that something was different. The space was not empty. There was a section of the inner body that had been modified carefully by someone who knew what they were doing, to include a small enclosed compartment. It was sealed, not welded shut, but fastened in a way that was clearly intentional, clearly deliberate, and clearly designed to be undetectable from the exterior of the car. Ethan crouched there in the fluorescent light for a long moment, his forearm resting on his knee, just looking. Then he found the release mechanism, a simple latch, concealed behind a rivet that looked structural but was not, and he opened it. Inside was a single envelope. Off-white. Heavier than standard paper stock. The kind that cost something. It had aged but not badly, protected by the seal and by whatever instinct had made a man choose this particular hiding place for this particular thing. On the front, In handwriting that was clear despite its age, were 11 words. Ethan read them once in silence. Then he read them again. For Victoria. Only when she is truly ready. He sat back on his heels and stayed very still. Outside, a freight train moved through the rail yard with the slow grinding thunder of something enormous in motion. Gerald knocked twice in the corner and went quiet. Ethan set the envelope down on the workbench without opening it, and took out his phone and began searching. It did not take long. The car's VIN was in the records. The previous registered owner before the estate transfer was listed as Richard M. Hayes. 3 minutes of searching told him everything he needed to know. Richard Hayes had founded Hayes Global Holdings in 1989. He had built it over 30 years into one of the most significant private equity firms on the East Coast. He had died 4 years ago of complications from a form of cancer that moved faster than anyone expected. His daughter was Victoria Hayes. She had inherited the company and taken it further than most analysts had predicted. Ethan looked at the envelope for a long time. He was not a man given to dramatic gestures or complicated decisions. His life had been built on a certain practical clarity. You did what was right because it was right. And you did not wait for the math to work out in your favor first. He had returned wallets and phones and once, memorably, a paper bag containing $11,000 in cash that someone had left on the seat of a car he was working on, and that bag had gone back without hesitation because the alternative was not something he could actually live in. This was different from that. And also exactly like that. The envelope did not belong to him. The person it was addressed to was still alive. The rest was simple. He opened it only enough to confirm what it was, reading the first few lines to be certain it was not a legal document or a business instrument that required different handling. It was neither of those things. It was a letter. He could see that immediately from the tone of the opening sentences, from the way the handwriting softened in the margins where a man had chosen his words carefully, from the date at the top, which was 11 years before Richard Hayes had died, written when no one yet knew what was coming. Ethan folded the envelope closed, set it back on the workbench, and stood up. He was going to find Victoria Hayes. He had no idea how long it was going to take. He did not read the full letter that night. He would tell himself afterward that this was practical. He had confirmed the letter's nature and its owner, which was sufficient, but the truth was simpler than that. It felt wrong to read it. Whatever Richard Hayes had written in that car, in those careful lines that softened at the margins, it had not been written for Ethan Carter. It had been written for a woman who had not been ready when her father was alive, and who deserved to encounter it without a stranger having consumed it first. What he had read those first few lines, absorbed before he made himself stop, stayed with him anyway. He drove home through the empty streets thinking about it. He went to bed without fully shaking it loose. In the morning, he made breakfast for himself and thought about fathers and daughters and the particular tragedy of things left unsaid. Not from cruelty or indifference, but from the specific kind of pride that mistakes distance for strength. He had known men like that. He suspected he had been a version of that man himself in the early years when Marcus was small and Ethan was still running from the wreckage of his marriage and could not quite figure out how to let the boy all the way in. He had figured it out eventually. He was still figuring it out. He thought about Richard Hayes sitting in that car on a Saturday morning, driving alone to think. And he felt a kind of kinship with a man he had never met and would never meet, which was one of the strange properties of other people's grief. It found its shape in the spaces of your own. Reaching Victoria Hayes turned out to be significantly harder than finding her. Ethan called the main number for Hayes Global and was redirected 3 times before reaching a coordinator who took his information with professional neutrality and told him that Miss Hayes received all correspondence through her executive office and that if he had a matter of importance, he was welcome to submit it in writing. He submitted it in writing. He included photographs of the envelope and of the compartment where it had been found. He described who he was and what he had found, and made clear that he was not seeking compensation and had no commercial interest in the matter. He sent the letter by certified mail and by email to 3 addresses he was able to find through the company's public contacts. He waited 2 weeks and heard nothing. He tried again. He sent a more detailed explanation, He thought about giving up and then thought about the 11 words on the envelope and didn't. He had been at it for 5 weeks when his phone rang on a Thursday morning, and a woman with a precise voice told him that Miss Hayes would see him for 15 minutes the following Monday, that the address was the Hayes Global offices on the 42nd floor of a building downtown, and that he should bring identification. He thanked her and went back to the brake job he had been in the middle of, and only when he had finished and was washing his hands did he register what had just happened and allow himself a moment of something that felt, quietly, like relief. The lobby of Hayes Global was the kind of space that was designed to communicate, before a word was spoken, that the people who worked here operated in a register above ordinary life. The floors were pale stone. The ceiling was high enough to make sound disappear. A woman at the reception desk checked his name against a list and gave him a visitor's badge and directed him to elevators that opened without noise onto a floor where the light was warm and the carpet absorbed footsteps and the view of the city spread out through floor to ceiling. Glass like a painting of a city rather than an actual one. He was shown to a conference room and left there for 7 minutes, which he assumed was deliberate. Victoria Hayes came in without preamble. She was shorter than he expected. Though he could not have said what he had expected, she wore a dark blazer and the particular kind of composure that people acquire when they have spent years in rooms where composure is both armor and currency. She sat down across from him and looked at him with eyes that were assessing and not unkind, and she said she understood he had found something in a vehicle she had sold. He said yes. He said he had found it a few weeks after purchasing the car, while performing the initial teardown. He said he had taken steps to confirm the car's provenance and to determine who the item was intended for. He did not say that he had spent 5 weeks trying to reach her, though she probably knew. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, which was the best jacket he owned, and he placed the envelope on the conference table between them. He did not slide it toward her. He left it in the middle of the table, equidistant, and he said the only thing that seemed worth saying, "I think it belongs to you." Victoria Hayes looked at the envelope. She did not move for several seconds. From where Ethan sat, he could see the slight change in her expression, something tightening around the eyes, and then releasing, the way a muscle releases when it has been held rigid for too long. She looked at the 11 words on the front. Then she looked at Ethan with an expression he could not quite read. And she said, "Was this everything that had been in the compartment?" He said yes. She said she would need a moment. He said he understood, and he meant it, and he waited. She picked up the envelope. She turned it over once in her hands, and Ethan could see the handwriting had done something to her, that small, involuntary stiffening that is not quite a flinch but is related to one. She set it down again and looked at him and asked if he would excuse her for a few minutes. He stood up and stepped out into the corridor, and the woman who had shown him in appeared almost immediately and offered him water, which he accepted, and he stood by the window looking out at the city, laid flat and vast below, and thought about nothing in particular. Because there was nothing useful to think about. Whatever was happening in that conference room was not his business. He had done what he came to do. He was on his second glass of water when she opened the door. Victoria Hayes had been a CEO for 4 years and a composed person for most of her life. And she was not, in any obvious way, undone. But something had shifted in the room, the way the air shifts after a window is opened, subtly, but perceptibly, to anyone paying attention. Her eyes were dry, her expression was controlled, but there was something at the edges of her face that had not been there when he walked in, something that made her look, for just a moment, less like a woman who ran a $300 million enterprise, and more like someone who had just heard something that split her life cleanly into before and after. She asked him to sit down again. He did. She asked him how he had found the compartment. He told her about the door panel, the way it had come away too easily, the modified cavity, the latch disguised as a structural rivet. He could tell from the way she listened that she had not known it existed. He could also tell she was not entirely surprised that it did, which told him something about the kind of man her father had been, someone for whom hidden things were not implausible. She asked him if he had read the letter. He told her the truth, which was that he had read a few lines to confirm what it was before stopping. She asked him what those lines said. He told her that they were personal, that they were clearly from a father to a daughter, and that they were not his to repeat. She nodded, as if this was the answer she had expected, or perhaps the answer she had hoped for. They sat in a silence that was not awkward. Outside, the city carried on at its remove, 42 floors below, indifferent to everything happening in this quiet room. After a moment, she asked him why he had gone to so much trouble. 5 weeks, she said. She had seen the communication log. Multiple attempts. He could have kept the car, the compartment, everything. And no one would have known. He considered the question, because it was a genuine one, and deserved a genuine answer. He said he supposed it came down to the fact that some things couldn't be assigned a value, and that those were usually the things that mattered most. He said it simply, without decoration, and then felt slightly self-conscious about it, which Victoria appeared to notice, because something around her mouth softened very briefly before settling again. She thanked him. It was formal and brief, and he could tell it cost her something, because she was not accustomed to being in a position where a stranger had done something for her that she could not reciprocate on equal terms. He told her there was no thanks required. He meant it. He stood to go, and they shook hands. And he took the elevator down through the quiet building and walked out into the cold afternoon air of the city street and drove back to the shop. He told no one. Not Danny, not Rob, not Marcus. It was not his story to tell. Victoria Hayes sat in the conference room for a long time after he left. She read the letter twice. The first time was with her CEO's mind still partly engaged, processing and cataloging, looking for what was real and what was not. The second time she read it as herself, as Richard Hayes's daughter, as the girl who had once ridden in the passenger seat of this same car on Sunday mornings when she was 7 years old, standing up on the seat with her small hand resting on the dashboard while her father drove too fast on the empty county roads and laughed in the way he only laughed when no one was watching. She had not thought about those mornings in years. She had not allowed herself to, because the memory came attached to everything that came after it, the long years of his absences, the dinners alone, the school events he missed, the careful distance he maintained even when he was physically present, as if there were a sheet of glass between him and everyone he loved, and he had never quite found the way through it. The third time she read it, she was not reading at all. She was sitting with the pages open in her lap, her hands still, looking at the ceiling of a conference room she used 40 or 50 times a year to conduct business with the world, and she was crying in the absolutely silent way that only happens when the feeling is too large to make any noise. There were no sobs. Her face barely moved. The tears simply arrived, and she did not attempt to stop them, because it occurred to her for the first time, in as long as she could remember, that she was alone in a room. And that being alone in a room meant that the composure she maintained for everyone else was optional, and that she could, for a few minutes, simply feel what she felt without managing it. She let it go. She sat there in the good conference room light, and let all of it move through her, the grief for the father she had lost, the deeper grief for the understanding she had not arrived at while he was still alive to receive it, and underneath both of those, something else, something she had not anticipated and could not immediately name, which was a kind of gratitude so acute it was almost physical, because the letter existed, because he had written it and hidden it, and because a stranger with a flashlight and an honest disposition had reached through the years and placed it in her hands. She had spent the years since his death believing she understood him. She had sorted him into a category-driven, successful, emotionally unavailable, and she had filed him there with the careful efficiency she applied to everything, and she had told herself the filing was done. The letter dismantled the filing system. Richard Hayes had written it 11 years before he died, in a period when he had no reason to believe death was imminent, which made it in some ways more devastating than a deathbed confession would have been. He had not written it because he was out of time. He had written it because he finally had the language for what he had never managed to say out loud, and because he was afraid that language would fail him again in person, and because the car was the place where he thought most clearly, and so the car was where he had put it. He wrote about the glass. He knew the glass was there. He named it precisely, the way someone names a thing only after they have spent a long time understanding it. He wrote about the fear that had lived inside the building of his empire, not the confident fear of risk, but a quieter one, the fear of being the kind of man his daughter would remember with disappointment. He had done everything he could think of to preempt that disappointment, and in doing so had created exactly the conditions for it, and he had known this for years without knowing what to do about it. He wrote about the company, not in the way he had always talked about it as a legacy, as a structure, as a system built to endure, but as a thing that had begun with fear and been sustained by love, though he had never called it that. He wrote about the early years, which Victoria barely remembered. She had been 4 years old when Hayes Global was a single office in a building that smelled like carpeting and ambition and the lunches of other people's businesses. She did not know what those years had actually cost. What she read in those pages changed what she thought she knew about the foundation of everything she had inherited. In the early years, Richard had come within weeks of losing the company entirely. The financing he had arranged collapsed. The deal he had structured around it collapsed. He had employees depending on him and obligations he could not meet, and he had been sitting in the passenger seat of someone else's car. He described this, specifically telling his best friend and business school classmate that he was going to have to fold, that it was over, that he had been wrong to think he could build this. James had listened to all of it without speaking, and then he had said he was going to liquidate his own portfolio, a significant sum, years of careful saving, and put it into Hayes Global on one condition, which was that Richard never thank him for it and never make it the subject of a conversation between them again. Richard had tried to refuse. James had told him to be quiet and sign the document. Richard signed it. James Whitfield was dead within 2 years. A car accident on a highway in the rain. A collision with a truck that crossed the center line. A thing so random and final that Richard had never fully absorbed it. He had spent the next 30 years honoring the debt in the only way left to him, quietly, without announcement, supporting James's widow and his 2 children through channels designed to be invisible. Tuition paid anonymously, medical bills settled through a third party, a trust established in James's name that funded scholarships for business students from working families, a trust that Richard never mentioned in interviews or press releases or the public accounting of his philanthropy, a trust that simply existed and did its work without him needing credit for it. Victoria had never known any of this. She had run the company for 4 years without knowing this. She had inherited the balance sheets and the board composition and the operational history and the legal structure of everything her father had built, and she had not known that the first brick had been laid by someone else's sacrifice, or that the entire structure was, at its foundation, a monument to a debt her father had spent his life trying to repay. She sat with this for a very long time. When she finally left the conference room, the office was nearly empty. It was past 7 in the evening. She drove herself home, which she rarely did, and she sat in the driveway of her estate for a few minutes before going inside. And she thought about the car that had sat in the garage for 4 years, and about what it had been carrying, and about the man who had found it and driven across the city and sat in her conference room and put it on the table and asked for nothing. In the weeks that followed, Victoria did something she had not done since taking over the company. She slowed down. Not publicly, not in any way that showed in the quarterly numbers or the board meetings or the strategy sessions that continued as scheduled, but internally, she turned something down and turned something else up. She went back to the original incorporation documents of Hayes Global and read them from the beginning. She sat with the company's oldest board member, a man named Arthur Greer, who had known her father for 40 years, and she asked him questions she had never asked before, and listened to the answers with a patience she had not known she possessed. She found the Whitfield Foundation in the filings, cross-referenced it, traced its history through 3 decades of quiet operation. She called the foundation's current administrator, who was a woman named Patricia, and who seemed unsurprised by the call, as if she had been waiting for it for some time. Patricia told her that Richard Hayes had called every year on James Whitfield's birthday, that he had attended both of James's children's college graduations, sitting in the back, leaving before the ceremony ended, that he had never asked for any acknowledgement of any kind, and that the foundation's anonymous structure had been maintained specifically to honor James's request, the one condition James had set when he agreed to save the company, which was that Richard never make it about himself. Victoria asked Patricia if she had known Richard well. Patricia said she had, and that he was a man who carried a great deal of weight, and that she had always suspected there was a version of him that almost no one ever saw. Victoria thought about that for a long time after she hung up. She thought about the glass. She thought about her own version of it, the particular way she had learned to keep people at a useful distance, to process emotion efficiently, and not let it linger in her body where it might compromise her judgment. She had learned this from her father. She had assumed she had learned it because it was simply the correct way to operate. She was no longer certain it was entirely correct, and she was no longer certain she wanted it to be. She did not call Ethan Carter for 3 weeks. When she did, it was a Thursday morning, and she was sitting in a car she had rented for the occasion rather than her driver, parked outside his shop, which was smaller and more lived in than she had expected, with a hand-painted sign above the bay doors and a coffee can of cigarette butts outside the entrance that suggested at least one employee had a habit she did not approve of. She watched the shop for a few minutes. She could see through the open bay door a man working on the undercarriage of a raised sedan, moving with the deliberate economy of someone who had done this particular thing 10,000 times and had arrived at the version of it that wasted nothing. She got out of the car. Ethan looked up from beneath the sedan when she appeared in the bay entrance, and his expression did something that she would later describe to herself as honest. It registered surprise, and then a kind of understanding, and then he put down his wrench and stood up and said simply that she was welcome to come in. He showed her around the shop the way someone shows a visitor around a place they are genuinely proud of, which is without performance, pointing out what things were and what they did, including the space heater in the corner, which he introduced by name, which made her laugh in a way she had not expected. She asked him why he hadn't read the letter. He told her he had read a few lines and stopped because it hadn't felt right, which was an answer she understood in a way she could not have articulated 3 weeks earlier, and could now articulate precisely. She asked him about the car, what he thought of it, what condition it was actually in, what would be required to restore it. He talked about it for several minutes with a technical specificity that she recognized as the voice of someone who had spent a very long time learning something and had no need to perform that knowledge for an audience. He was not speaking to impress her. He was just answering her question. She found this, in the specific context of her life, remarkable. She told him what the letter had contained. Not all of it, but enough, the broad shape of it, the debt, the friendship, the glass, the 30 years of quiet work. She watched him listen. He did not say the right things because he was not calculating what the right things were. He said what he actually thought, which was that it sounded like a man who had spent his whole life trying to pay back something that couldn't be paid back, and that the tragedy was not the debt but the fact that he could never tell his daughter that that was what he was doing. Ethan said he thought he understood that. He said most men were better at acting on the things they felt than naming them, and that this was probably not a flaw of character but of language, and that the language usually existed somewhere, only sometimes people found it too late. Victoria looked at him for a moment. She asked if he had a son. He said yes, 12 years old, named Marcus. And the way he said the name contained the entire structure of what Marcus meant to him, which was a great deal. She asked if he ever found it hard. He said he found it hard every day, and that this was how he knew it was the thing that mattered most. She left the shop and sat in her rented car for a while and looked at the hand-painted sign and thought. The proposal she made 6 weeks later was not impulsive and was not charity. She had spent those 6 weeks doing what she had spent her professional life learning to do, which was to look at something that existed in one form and understand what it could become in another. What she saw in Carter Auto Repair was a mechanic of genuine expertise in a space that was too small for what he was capable of, constrained by the economics of standard repair work, when what he actually knew how to do, what he was actually built for, was the kind of restoration work that the vintage car market paid handsomely for, and that required a set of skills most people in the business did not have. She saw the infrastructure that needed to exist. She saw what it would cost to build it. She ran the numbers 4 different ways, and they were consistent. She made the call on a Monday and stated the terms clearly. She was not offering a favor. She was offering an investment capital and resources to convert and expand the facility, to create a properly equipped restoration center, to build the operational framework for a sustainable premium business. In exchange, she was taking a minority equity stake at a valuation she had calculated carefully, and that was fair. She was not asking him to change what he did or how he did it. She was asking to build the space around it that it deserved. He could take it or leave it. She had no attachment to the outcome. There was a silence on the other end of the line that lasted long enough for her to wonder if he had declined already and simply hadn't found the words yet. Then he said he needed to think about it. She said she would expect nothing less. He asked her why she was doing this. She said because the alternative, leaving what he did in the place where it currently lived, seemed like a waste that she did not know how to justify. She was not sure this was the whole truth. She was not sure the whole truth was something she needed to say out loud. He called her back on Wednesday and said yes. The renovation took 4 months. The new facility occupied twice the original footprint, with 2 additional bays equipped specifically for restoration work, a climate-controlled storage area, a dedicated fabrication space, and a small showroom that faced the street and drew attention in a way the old shop never had. Ethan's 2 original mechanics stayed. He hired 3 more, choosing each of them with the same care he had always applied to the cars, looking for people who understood that the work was not about speed but about attention, not about transaction but about something that outlasted the transaction. Marcus spent weekends at the shop, doing homework at the workbench and asking questions that Ethan answered in full, because he had decided a long time ago that his son would grow up knowing what his father did and why his father loved it. Victoria came by every month or 2, usually on a Saturday morning, arriving in a car she drove herself. She would walk through the bays and talk to Ethan about whatever was on the lift, and he would explain it in the same way he always did, technically and honestly, without simplification, and she would listen with the same attention she brought to the board table, which was to say, the full weight of it, nothing held back. They had developed, without announcing it, a friendship of the kind that is built on the particular respect that forms when 2 people recognize in each other something they don't often encounter. The ability to do one's work without performance, to mean what one says, and to ask nothing beyond what is reasonable. In the spring, a year after the renovation opened, Ethan finished the Porsche. It had taken 8 months of work spread across the other projects. Approached not as a commercial restoration, but as a separate undertaking entirely, with a different standard and a different purpose. He had sourced original components through channels that required patience and international correspondence. He had found a paint match for the original British racing green that required 3 attempts to get right, the color shifting in different lights, in the same way the original had. He had rebuilt the engine to factory specification, which meant weeks of work on components that had not been touched in decades, coaxing the machine back to what it had been when it left the factory in Stuttgart more than 50 years ago. The interior he had done last, taking the most care there, because the interior was where a person had actually lived with the car, where their hands had been, where their weight had rested, where the conversation between driver and machine actually happened. He called Victoria when it was done. She drove out that Saturday morning and stood in the bay doorway and looked at it in silence for a long time. He did not say anything. He had learned when to let a moment be a moment. The car was not sold. It was not put into the showroom, though it would have anchored that room beautifully. Victoria arranged instead for it to be placed in a small private exhibition space attached to the new facility, a room with good light and a climate system and a single bench in the center where you could sit and look at it. On the wall beside the car was a simple frame containing a printed copy of Richard's letter, redacted of the most private passages, but retaining the core of what he had said. There was no title on the frame and no plaque beneath the car. It was enough, Victoria felt, to simply be in the room with both things and understand what they had to do with each other. On the morning the exhibition space opened, she stood beside the car and looked at it for a long time. Ethan was beside her, his hands in the pockets of his work jacket, and the spring light came in through the skylight above them, and lay flat and gold across the hood and the roof of the machine that had kept it secret for years. Victoria said that her father had left her more than a company. She said he had left her a chance to understand who he actually was, which was something she had stopped believing was possible. and which turned out to be the most valuable inheritance of all. More valuable than the company, more valuable than the buildings and the holdings and the strategy documents, because it was the one thing she had genuinely needed and had not known how to ask for. Ethan looked at the car. He thought about the evening he had crouched in the shop with his flashlight and found the latch and opened the compartment, and the weight of the envelope in his hand and the 11 words on the front. He thought about how little it had seemed to understand where the thing would lead, how a letter inside a car could reach across years and silence, and the particular grief of misunderstanding and land, finally, in the hands of the person it had always been traveling toward. He thought about his own son, 12 years old, and asking questions at the workbench, and about the conversations he was trying to have in real time, rather than storing up for some future moment that might never come. He thought about the glass, and how a person could look at it from inside and mistake it for protection when it was actually just distance wearing the appearance of strength. He said nothing. He stood there in the good light, beside the woman who had become, without either of them planning for it, one of the more important people in his life, and he looked at the car that had carried a secret across years and given it to the right hands, and he thought that this was perhaps what all the things we build and love and leave behind were actually for, not the monument, not the legacy, not the institution, but the moment someone finds the hidden compartment and recognizes that what's inside was always meant for them. The most valuable things are rarely the ones we can see. They live inside the structures we build around them, inside the engines and the frameworks, and the companies we construct to outrun our own fear, and they wait there, patient as metal, for the right person at the right moment to stop and look carefully, and find the latch, and open it, and understand, finally, what was being said all along. A single honest act can restore what the years have buried. It can hand back what was never truly lost, only hidden, and waiting, and quietly certain that someone would come. And sometimes the person who comes is no one remarkable. Sometimes they are simply someone who believes that every car has a story, and who decides, in an empty shop on a cold October evening, that the story is worth more than the scrap metal, that the right thing to do is also the only thing to do, that what cannot be priced is precisely what must be protected. In the end, Ethan Carter had not changed Victoria Hayes's life through any grand act of heroism. He had done something smaller and rarer. He had been trustworthy when no one was watching, when there was no audience, when the calculation that would have kept the letter in the car or sold it or simply discarded it would have been, in every practical sense, the easier calculation to make. He had made the other calculation instead, and everything that followed, the friendship, the restoration, the room with the good light and the Porsche and the letter on the wall, and Marcus asking questions at the workbench, and Victoria sitting with the pages in her lap in a quiet room, finally allowing herself to feel what she felt had grown from that single ordinary moment of choosing decency without an audience, which is, in the end, the only kind of decency that counts, the only kind that lasts, the only kind that can reach across years of silence and find the person waiting on the other side.